About 15 years ago now, I spent some time in New Zealand. I was over there about 3 months. A very good friend of mine, Shuna Giles, kept in touch ever since, invited me over. She'd been to visit me briefly in England, and I went over there with the idea of actually maybe even living there, and it would have been a very nice dream as well. I did love it there. The fishing and the climate was fantastic. I didn't do any filming at that time, didn't have the video cameras then. What I did do were plenty of photographs, so I thought what I would do in this film is put together the photographs that I took of the actual place and the events, the landscape and so on. And I did a lot of painting when I was there. And I thought I'd intersperse this whole film with the artwork from that time. So we get a few photographs of the place and then the photographs of the paintings as I go along, painting the scenery throughout the whole trip. It's a wonderful time, a time that I really do value. It would be lovely to go there again one day even, but I doubt that's going to happen. And I thought you might like to share this and see this series of paintings that I did. It's everything from acrylics through to watercolours to pastel and water and pastels and mixed medium. All different sorts of scenes, from seascapes to beaches up to the sort of tropical jungles and the tree ferns and so on. Absolutely wonderful. So I'll just play these through to you and do a little bit of narration as I go along, and you can share that lovely trip I had that time and the diversity of the artwork that I did.
The year before this trip, I'd flown to Houston in Texas, and I'd used British Airways. Unfortunately, at the far end, there'd been a slight problem, I having difficulties with mobility, and I wasn't too pleased with the service, and they very kindly offered me a free club class ticket anywhere in the world return. Well, of course, where else to take it but the other side of the world and back. I was most grateful for this, because although I normally enjoy flying, such a long journey, a long haul flight, is not good for my back, and it really was a whole new world, and possibly one I'll never afford again, ranging from the club class departure lounge with sandwiches and booze, right through to entering the plane. As I entered the plane, the stewardess was ushering on people like sheep, this way, that way, left, right, seat so and so. Then she looked at my ticket and said, "Oh, club class, sir, this way please," and changed her attitude completely, taking me down to the club class seats. Most amusing and almost like a television comedy. My hostess Shuna lived at Palmerston North, as you can see on here, and that's where I was going to stay for most of my stay of the 3 months, doing up a property there with her and painting, and then going down to Marlborough in the South Island to do a demonstration and hold an exhibition later on. Previously, Shuna, who was a midwife in New Zealand, had always lived in more modern properties, but she'd purchased this one which needed a lot of renovation, but in hundreds of acres, which was absolutely delightful. It was an old timber frame building and had wonderful surroundings and outbuildings and gardens with oranges and lemons and all sorts growing in it. A previous owner had mistakenly planted bamboo both around the house and down in the woodland, and this stuff was literally taking over. We had to get a digger in to dig it right out before it lifted the house up. It was already lifting up the pavements. It did have other uses though, and I made this rocking chair out of it. The climate was very similar to our own, and I soon developed really nice vegetable gardens there, and we were having produce from those gardens throughout that first summer. The outdoor life was the main thing, absolutely fantastic. You could drive for 30 miles and not see anybody. The land surrounding Shuna's house was mainly meadows, and she let those out to the farmer next door for his sheep, in exchange for a sheep pre-butchered every year. This is a pastel and water on hot press watercolour paper that I did in her grounds. The composition was taken from this view as we look down from the house across the valley. Just to the left there you see this next gum tree that I painted as well using pastel. At the very bottom of the valley was this track running down to a small farm shack, and I decided to use that for a pastel as well. Nearly all the farming there was either dairy or sheep, and I used to refer to the sheep as maggots on the hillside. Here's a watercolour that I did of a scene locally, and you see the sheep are all over the hillsides there looking like maggots crawling up grass. Shuna and I had met via the internet, seemed to get on very well. We had similar outdoor interests, although she was very much into walking and hiking, which has continued ever since. I'm not so much into that due to my back, but I managed to keep up most of the time when we were over there, taking these wonderful walks along the coast and throughout the countryside. And when she wanted to go off on one of her treks, I would sit down and paint, and I'd still be there when she got back. She's a gifted artist herself, and has a strong interest in patchwork and quilting, has many friends that do it as well. When I was over there I had the privilege to do a painting for one of her friends, which you'll see shortly, of their house, in fact more the gardens with the house behind, and in exchange the friend very kindly gave me a beautiful piece of quilt work, which hangs on my wall now in France. I love that property there, and in fact if I could have purchased it off her and lived over there myself, I probably would have done so, because I did like the life in New Zealand, the fishing, the outdoor lifestyle, everything in fact. But it wasn't to be, and this is one of the reasons I bought in France later on. A shame though, but it's not easy to go across to New Zealand. It's such a long way away, and there are great difficulties in actually being allowed to remain there. Shuna had visited England earlier, and I was over there for 3 months in New Zealand, helped renovate her house and work on the gardens, and also went down to South Island, where I was an artist in residence, held an exhibition, and did some workshops as well. The landscape was just so diverse and superb. One moment you could be in landscapes like this, which could have been in Scotland or even in Yorkshire. The next moment you could be in subtropical areas that were like being in a jungle with tree ferns, and the next you could be in a volcanic area where you actually had volcanoes and smoke and steam coming out of geysers and hot water basins and so on. But for me as a fisherman, that was the great interest. Not only was the sea fishing good around the coast, but the trout fishing was the best in the world. Beautiful rivers and lakes, full of trout. Not always full of trout, I must admit. There were times when they were water-licked and we found it very hard to fish. Once you had a licence, providing you had access to the river, you could fish almost anywhere you liked. We had brown trout and rainbow trout, and some of those were monsters. It was just finding where they were. Shuna had several friends that fished. Steve is one of them that you see here. And these people very kindly guided me, took me around, not only fishing on the river banks, but also out in their boats as well. This does not mean that the fish were easy to catch at all. Some places you could see the fish coming in after your lures, and could you get them to take? No way. They'd been fished for before, and they were very shy. The fish didn't always stay in one place either, as at times in certain seasons they moved up and down for spawning. The brown trout especially, such as this big one, would move at spawning times. On the rivers, fly fishing was the main method. And they had some extraordinarily flies for some of these big fish as well. Let me show you some here. You might get an idea of how large some of these trout are by the size of these lures. As you see, some of them are virtually life-size replicas of mice and frogs. I gather if you knew where to go, you could catch brown trout up to about 8 pound, but we didn't take any large brown trout, 1 or 2 smaller ones, and rainbows to about 3 pound. There were some areas that you couldn't fish, either because they were traditional Maori sites and so had historical value, or because they were naturally protected. Perhaps, for instance, they had large eels coming up, and in some areas you could get massive eels. We saw them swimming up to about 5 or 6 foot long sometimes. You might think they were conger eels. And whilst fishing, of course, I found some beautiful spots to paint, such as these. This one with water and pastel, and this one just watercolour, as I sat there on a road bridge looking up this lovely trout river, did it in watercolour. All of these pictures of the rivers and so on have been using pastel on watercolour paper with water. It's a very, very rapid, loose technique. Lake Taupo was a massive extinct volcano that had literally filled up and become a huge lake, freshwater lake. It had masses of monster rainbow trout in it, and one of Shuna's friends very kindly looked after us there, both in his house and in a batch nearby. A batch is just another wooden house, or a large bungalow if you like. Many people would consider it a second home, or as good as a home. But over in New Zealand they nearly all have these batches, which are prefabricated or wooden homes, as well as their own home. My host showed me how to fillet and then marinade the fish that we caught, a recipe of sugar, salt and soya sauce, and then we would hot smoke these overnight, and they were absolutely delicious. This next watercolour study was one that I did before breakfast, as the sun was rising over Lake Taupo, the view from the bedroom that we had. This one only uses watercolour and has that lovely transparency and looseness that only watercolour can have. During our time there, Shuna was kind enough to take me all over the islands, both north and south. There were volcanic areas like this, where I was able to draw with my pastels and do studies, with the view hundreds of feet below me. Not far away were the ski slopes, and then a few miles further down the road, bubbling hot springs where you could catch trout in one stream, swing them across and cook them in another. Further round the corner there'd be an area like Hampshire, and just over the hill from there, Scottish glens. So diverse was the countryside. Not only were the rivers crystal clear, but the sea was fantastic, and the beaches were absolutely wonderful. Beaches of miles and miles of sand with so much flotsam and wood washed up. Just beautiful for walking on and relaxing in, and so tranquil. And of course all of the shapes and patterns made by this driftwood that you could actually use in artwork, as you'll see me do later when I do a 3-dimensional piece. I did a whole series of works in many mediums, both abstract and figurative, You've just seen a figurative one where I've painted on plein air. Not only were the various textures in the sand that were made by water, by rain, by wind, and also of course the bits of shell and the broken driftwood, but also the reflections from the sky and the water added to the smooth against the rough, the light against the dark, the warm against the cool, and so we could build these textures up in abstracts like this as well. These were studio works done from photographs and enhanced, as is this one. But then we'll go on to working on plein air again. These beautiful sunsets where we could go out and not just work quickly with pastels, but also work very quickly with the oils. In this case doing an oil in about 10 or 15 minutes as the sun went down below the horizon and made these lovely reflections on the wet beach. On this rocky promontory, not only did I do some nice painting with the pastels, but also caught some good fish. I caught baby sharks, and this particular fish here, which we had for dinner, not quite sure what it was, but it didn't half give a fight in that rough surf. We went away to the coast and hired a cabin at Waipatiki Beach, a lovely place that I know remains a favourite to Shoona's, and she still goes with a very good friend of hers and the dogs, and stays there and walks and enjoys those beaches. I enjoyed them for all of these studies I did. This one was a very large water and pastel that I did overlooking the bay, and I think I did 7 paintings in one day that day, quite a large number considering I did that large one as well as these smaller pastels. So I could just sit on the rocks here. So one was done there with water and pastel, and all of these were done just with pastel and ongres paper and an ongres pad, each in about 10 or 15 minutes apiece. You really can't beat working on plein air, working out of doors, working in situ. You see much more, you feel so much more, you see more light, movement, colours, things are changing constantly. Yes, there are more difficulties with the light changing, with the sea moving, with the tide coming up and down. You've got to get all your gear out there, but this way of working with water and pastels is a very useful way to work just because of that. You can work again very loosely, very quickly. You can build things up, you can work over them. Once the pastel has been set with water, it is fixed, so you can work coats over the top in very, very lively ways such as this to get the effects of the rocks and the surf. Both sunrise and sunsets are perfect at such beaches, aren't they? Wonderful reflections as the tide comes in and out. Here we're near an area called Seal Island, and we're on the South Island, and I got this beautiful sunset coming down that I managed to work up with a full set of pastels, this time onto ongres paper. Then back to my oil paints at Seal Island, looking over the cliffs. Below we could hear and see the seals playing, and I set up my easel there and did an on plein air of these rather lovely succulent, almost like cacti that were growing on the side of the cliffs there, and the beautiful azure and turquoise green blue seas that were going out with the sun gradually setting down. It was late afternoon. Of course later on then, as we worked around the coast and the sun went right down, you got different effects again on the marshes. Such different moods, sometimes silver light, sometimes orange light. In this case we've got these beautiful blue greys. Then I could sit with my little pastel pad, the ongres pad again, on a beach here, looking down as the tide was gradually going out, and I did another fast study in about 10 minutes, which I've always been very pleased with. Somebody bought this one shortly afterwards, but I quite miss it because it was so lively. I try to keep a camera on me at most times, especially in events like this when doing the beach, because scenes like this can suddenly happen. These horses being exercised suddenly came trundling along the beach, running free as I call them, and I took a series of shots as they did so and then managed to do some studio pieces afterwards. I spoke about the amount of driftwood washed up, and here at Foxton Beach it was tremendous, washed right over the sand dunes into huge piles and sculptures. Absolutely amazing. So I did a large mixed media piece using Chinagraph pencil, water and pastel again, nice and lively, and I tried to get the strength of these logs that were cascading over the sand, almost as if it was a waterfall. This was great fun to do, and it was another on plein air piece. I then approached a gallery locally to take the work that I'd done, and they successfully sold a couple of pieces and hung a few, and then a buyer brought the entire collection just after I left New Zealand, and I think I've sold them all on since, which is very, very useful. Shuna, like me, is a great animal lover. She has dogs and cats, and in this case she was doing voluntary work for the NASA's Animal Centre, and I became involved with it as well and produced this large painting of a load of their different pets and animals that had been rescued to be auctioned off. This was duly auctioned and the money all went to the centre to help the animals and their welfare. This was another mixed medium work, using watercolour at first and then finally overlaying with soft pastels. Earlier on I'd mentioned using mixed media and driftwood from the beaches to make a large sculptural piece, and here we are, a two-dimensional piece reflecting my feelings about the island and New Zealand, built up with filler and bits of driftwood and textures and so on. One of the favourite places I visited and revisited and did paintings in as well as explored was Coppermine Creek. It was just like something from Raiders of the Lost Ark, as you can see here from this photograph as we looked inside outward. It was blocked off behind me, but what a wonderful scene it made for some adventure film. There were several of these old mines in the area, both copper and coal, which made very interesting walks. We used to tease Shuna about her walks. She would call them tramps. She'd be going off for a tramp, and I wondered about these poor old fellows that would be accosted by her on the way. Anyway, here I was sitting at the bottom of Coppermine Creek where she went off for one of her several-mile tramps, and I could just sit there at the bottom of the valley in the gorge looking up there doing a large on plein air pastel again. Continuing with the diversity of the island, I just loved the forests and the woodlands because they were so subtropical. These absolutely wonderful tree ferns, some of them are many, many years old. You could just wander through this and see nobody, the birds singing in the background, and a great place for lush paintings, as you can see here as I work through towards doing studies in oils. Not only was there a wonderful light and luminosity amongst all of these ferns and bits of woodland, but also the tonal values are so important. So as I do these studies here, I'm going to show you how I built this up, first by working up the light and mid-tones and lights, and then through to the darks and textures, but also how well that worked later on as a black and white, to show just how well the tones work. Here are my palettes as well, showing the various greens that I made from warms and cool greens. On South Island, one of the main features is Mount Taranaki and that beautiful lake below, a whole nature reserve there. Not an easy subject to paint, as the constant change of mood and climate, plus the amount of detail in this large scene, was very difficult to capture. I spent several weeks as artist in residence there at Marlborough Art Gallery, holding an exhibition and doing demonstrations, and one of the most pleasant memories I have is of various primary schools actually coming to visit. One of those primary schools came and sang me their national anthem. Absolutely wonderful, and I played with them using my large overton in low D, and it absolutely brought tears to my eyes, something I will never ever forget.